Chapter 10. Death at the Cinema. He put his hand in his pocket and brought out something. A long, thin knife that was sticky and red. Mr. Ledbetter was at the Regal Cinema in Doncaster. At the most exciting part of the film, the man next to him got up and pushed past him. Then he dropped his hat over the seat in front and bent over to get it back. Mr. Ledbetter was very annoyed. He had looked forward to seeing this film for a whole week. Why couldn't people wait until the end of a film? The annoying gentleman went out. Mr. Ledbetter watched the film happily until the end. When the lights went up, he got up slowly. He never left the cinema very quickly. He looked around. There weren't many people this afternoon. Naturally. It was the day of the St. Leger, and they were all at the races. Everyone was hurrying towards the exit. Mr. Ledbetter started to follow. The man in the seat in front of him was asleep. "Excuse me, sir," said a man who was trying to get past the sleeping gentleman. Mr. Ledbetter reached the exit. He looked back. Something seemed to be happening. Perhaps the man in front of him was drunk and not asleep. He stopped for a moment and then went out. The manager was saying to the man who had tried to get past, "He's ill." He spoke to the sleeping man. "What's the matter, sir?" The other man touched the sleeper. He took his hand away and looked at a red, sticky mark. "Blood!" The manager saw the corner of something under the seat. "It's an ABC," he said. Mr. Cust left the Regal Cinema and looked up at the sky. It was a beautiful evening. A really beautiful evening. He walked along, smiling to himself, until he came to the Black Horse, where he was staying. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, a small room on the second floor. As he entered the room, he suddenly stopped smiling. There was a mark on the arm of his coat. He touched it. Wet and red. Blood. He put his hand in his pocket and brought out something. A long, thin knife that was sticky and red. Mr. Cust sat down and looked around the room like a hunted animal. "It isn't my fault," he said. He passed his tongue over his lips. Then he went over to the sink and filled it with water. He took off his coat and washed the arm. The water was red now. There was a knock on the door. He stood there, frozen with fear. The door opened. It was a young woman carrying some water. "Oh, excuse me, sir. Your hot water, sir." "Thank you. I've washed in cold water." Immediately she looked at the water in the sink. I've cut my hand," said Mr. Cust quickly. There was a pause. Yes, surely a very long pause, before she said, "Yes, sir." She went out, shutting the door. Mr. Cust stood and listened. Were there voices, feet coming up the stairs? He could hear only the beating of his own heart. Then suddenly he moved. He put on his coat, went to the door, and opened it. There was no one outside. He went quietly down the stairs. He ran out of the door that opened onto the hotel car park. A couple of drivers were there, talking about the races. Mr. Cust hurried across the car park and out into the street. Should he go to the station? Yes, there would be crowds there, special trains. With a bit of luck, he could get away. Inspector Crome was interviewing Mr. Ledbetter. The Chief Constable, Colonel Anderson, was there too. "Please tell me everything clearly," said Crome. "This man went out towards the end of the main film. As he passed you, he fell." "He pretended to fall. I understand it now. He bent over the seat in front to pick up his hat. He surely stabbed the man then. Then he went out." "Can you describe him?" "He was a very big man." "Fair or dark?" Well, I'm not exactly sure. He was an ugly-looking man." Inspector Crome nodded. Then he interviewed the cinema manager. The manager told Crome about the blood on the dead man's coat and the ABC railway guide under the seat. "Did you notice a man leaving the cinema a few minutes earlier?" "There were several, sir." Just then a police constable came in. "Mr. Hercule Poirot's here, sir, and another gentleman." Inspector Crome didn't look pleased. "Oh, well," he said, "they'd better come in, I suppose." Poirot and I entered the room. Both Crome and Colonel Anderson were looking worried. Colonel Anderson greeted us with a nod of the head. "I'm glad you've come, Monsieur Poirot," he said politely. "Another ABC murder?" "Yes. The murderer bent over and stabbed the victim in the back. There was an ABC on the floor between the dead man's feet." "Do you know who the dead man is?" asked Poirot. "Yes, I think ABC's made a mistake this time. The dead man is called Earlsfield, George Earlsfield. He missed out the letter D." My friend shook his head doubtfully. "Shall we talk to the man who found him?" asked Crome. "He's anxious to get home." A middle-aged gentleman came in. He spoke in an excited, high voice. "It's the most shocking experience I've ever known," he said. "Your name, please?" said the inspector. "Downes. Roger Emmanuel Downes. I'm a teacher at a boys' school." "Now, Mr. Downes, please tell us in your own words what happened." "At the end of the film, I got up from my seat. The seat on my left was empty, but in the seat next to that there was a man who seemed to be asleep. I realized that he was ill, and I called out, 'Fetch the manager!' As I couldn't pass him, I put my hand on his shoulder to wake him. Then I took my hand from the man's shoulder. I found that it was wet and red." Colonel Anderson was looking at Mr. Downes. "Mr. Downes, you're a very lucky man. You're about the same height as the dead man. I think the murderer became confused. He followed you into the cinema, but he chose the wrong victim. I am sure, Mr. Downes, that that knife was meant for you." Mr. Downes became weak with shock. He sat down on a chair. "You mean that this madman has followed me? But why me?" He got up. He suddenly looked old and shaken. "If you don't want me any more, gentlemen, I think I'll go home. I don't feel very well." Mr. Downes left the room. "Send a couple of constables to watch his house," said Colonel Anderson. "You think," said Poirot, "that when ABC finds out his mistake, he might try to murder Mr. Downes again?" Anderson nodded. "It's a possibility," he said. "ABC may be upset if things don't go according to his plans." A constable came in. "Mr. Ball of the Black Horse is here with a young woman, sir," he said. "He thinks he has something to tell you which may be helpful." Mr. Ball was a large, slow-thinking, heavily moving man. He smelled strongly of beer. With him there was a young woman with round eyes. She seemed to be very excited. "This girl, Mary, has something to tell you," said Mr. Ball. Mary told us that she had taken hot water to one of the hotel guests in his room. He was washing his hands. He had taken his coat off and was holding the arm of it in the water in the sink. The coat was wet, and the water in the sink was red. "Red?" said Anderson sharply. "When was this?" "At about 5:15. "More than 3 hours ago," said Anderson. "Why didn't you come at once?" "We didn't know that there'd been another murder," said Ball. "When we heard the news, Mary screamed out about the blood in the sink. I went upstairs to the room, but there was nobody there. One of the men in the car park said he saw a man leaving, so I told Mary to come to the police." "Describe this man," said Inspector Crome to Mary. "He wasn't very tall or short," said Mary, "and he stooped and wore glasses. He was wearing a dark suit and a hat. His clothes looked old and cheap." Inspector Crome sent 2 men to the Black Horse. They came back about 10 minutes later and brought the hotel book, which all guests had to sign. We crowded around it. There was a signature there in small writing. "A.B. Case, or is it Cash?" said Colonel Anderson. "A.B.C., said Crome. "What about his luggage?" asked Anderson. "We found a suitcase in his room, sir, full of small boxes." "What was in them?" "Stockings, sir." "Congratulations," Crome said to Poirot. "Your guess was right." Inspector Crome was in his office at Scotland Yard. The telephone on his desk rang. It was one of the policemen who was helping him on the case. "Jacobs speaking, sir. A man has come with a story that you ought to hear." A few minutes later there was a knock on the door. Jacobs appeared with a tall young man. "This is Mr. Tom Hartigan, sir. He's got something to tell us which may be important in the ABC case." The inspector got up and shook hands with the visitor. "Good morning, Mr. Hartigan. Sit down. What do you want to tell me?" "Well," began Tom nervously, "I've got a young lady friend, you see, and her mother rents out rooms in her house. One of the rooms has been rented for over 2 years to a man called Cust." Tom told the inspector about his meeting with Mr. Cust at Euston Station, and the ticket for Doncaster which Mr. Cust had dropped. "Lily, my young lady, also told me that Mr. Cust was near Churston at the time of the murder, and at the seaside when the Bexhill murder happened. The newspapers said that information was wanted about A.B. Case, or Cash. Lily's mother, Mrs. Marbury, told me that Mr. Cust is A.B. Cust. Then we wondered if Mr. Cust had been away from home on the date of the Andover murder, and we remembered that he was." Inspector Crome listened to everything carefully. "You are quite right to come here," he said. "These dates may be only a coincidence, and the name too, but I'd certainly like to interview Mr. Cust. Is he at home now?" "Yes, sir." "When did he return?" "On the evening of the Doncaster murder, sir. He's stayed in a lot since then, and he doesn't look very well, Mrs. Marbury says. He buys a lot of newspapers. Mrs. Marbury says that he talks to himself too." Tom gave Inspector Crome Mrs. Marbury's address. "Thank you," said the inspector. "I shall probably visit the house later today. Please be careful if you meet Mr. Cust. Good morning, Mr. Hartigan." Tom went outside. Lily Marbury was waiting for him. He told her about his meeting with Inspector Crome. "The police are going to come and ask him some questions," he said. "Poor Mr. Cust," said Lily. "Don't feel sorry for him. If he's ABC, he's murdered 4 people." Lily shook her head. "It does seem awful," she said. "Come and have some lunch," said Tom. "All right, but I must just telephone someone, a girl I was going to meet." She ran across the road and came back, looking rather red in the face. She put her arm through Tom's arm. "Tell me more about Scotland Yard. You didn't see the other man there, the Belgian gentleman, the one that ABC writes to?" "No, he wasn't there." "Well, tell me all about it. Who did you speak to, and what did you say?" Mr. Cust put the phone back very gently. He turned to where Mrs. Marbury was standing, watching him. "You don't often have a telephone call, Mr. Cust," she said. "I hope it's not bad news." "No, no." He saw that Mrs. Marbury was holding a newspaper. He read, "Births, marriages, deaths." My sister's just had a little boy, he said quickly. Well, that is nice, said Mrs. Marbury. She wondered why Mr. Cust had never said he had a sister. Well, Mr. Cust, my congratulations. Is it the first one, or have you other little nephews and nieces? It's the only one, said Mr. Cust. The only one I've ever had, or am likely to have, and, I think I must go there at once. They want me to come. I think I can just catch a train if I hurry. Will you be away long, Mr. Cust? Called Mrs. Marbury as he ran up the stairs. Oh, no, 2 or 3 days, that's all. He disappeared into his bedroom. A few minutes later, he came quietly down the stairs, carrying a bag in his hand. He saw the telephone and remembered the short conversation he had just had. Is that you, Mr. Cust? I thought you might like to know that an inspector from Scotland Yard may come to see you. Why had Lily telephoned him? Had she guessed his secret? How did she know that the inspector was coming? Did she know? But surely, if she knew, she wouldn't... Women were very strange, surprisingly cruel and surprisingly kind. Lily was a kind girl. A kind, pretty girl. He paused in the hall. Then he heard a noise from the kitchen. Mrs. Marbury might come out. He opened the front door, passed through it, and closed it behind him. Where? Poirot and I were having another meeting with the Chief Constable, Colonel Anderson, and Inspector Crome. I've got a list of people in the Churston area where the man went and offered stockings, said Inspector Crome. He stayed at a small hotel. He returned there at 10:30 on the night of the murder. He did the same thing in Bexhill. He stayed at a hotel under his own name and offered stockings to people at about 12 addresses, including Mrs. Barnard and including the Orange Cat. He did the same in Andover. He stayed at a small hotel there, too, and offered stockings to Mrs. Fowler, next door to Mrs. Asher, and to several other people in the same street. I went to the address which Mr. Hartigan gave me, said the inspector, but I found that Cust had left the house about half an hour before. He received a telephone message. Mrs. Marbury said it was the first time. I searched his room very carefully. I found notepaper there similar to the paper which the letters were written on. There was also a large quantity of stockings, and at the back of the same cupboard there were 8 new ABC railway guides. That proves he's guilty, said Colonel Anderson. I found something else, too, said the inspector. I only found it this morning, sir. There was no sign of the knife in his room, but I thought perhaps he'd brought it back to the house and hidden it somewhere. I found it immediately. The coat stand. No one ever moves a coat stand. I moved it away from the wall, and there it was, the knife. The dried blood was still on it. "Good work, Crome," said Colonel Anderson. "We only need one thing more now. The man himself." "Don't worry, we'll get him," said Crome. "But there is something that worries me very much," said Poirot. "It is the why, the motive." "But, my dear Poirot, the man's crazy," said Colonel Anderson impatiently. "Well, as you say, Crome, it's just a matter of time before we find him." Mr. Cust stood by a fruit and vegetable shop, staring across the road. Yes, that was it. A. Asher, newsagent. In the empty window there was a sign, "Shop to rent." He walked slowly back towards the main street of the town. It was difficult, very difficult, now that he hadn't any more money. He hadn't had anything to eat all day. He looked at a board outside another newsagent's shop. "The ABC case, murderer still free. Interviews with Hercule Poirot." Mr. Cust said to himself, "Hercule Poirot. I wonder if he knows." He continued walking. Where was he going? He didn't know. He had come to the end. He looked up. There were lights in front of him, and letters. Police station. "That's funny," said Mr. Cust. He gave a little laugh. Then he stepped inside. Suddenly, as he did so, he fell forward. Chapter 11. And Catch a Fox. "He said the whole country would talk about me. But he said I would die a violent death." It was a clear November day. Dr. Thompson and Chief Inspector Japp had come to tell Poirot about the police case against Alexander Bonaparte Cust. "What's your opinion of Cust?" Poirot asked Dr. Thompson. "I don't know. He doesn't seem to be mad. He's an epileptic, of course." "Yes, that was clear when he fell into the police station in Andover," I said. "But can a man murder someone and not know they've done it?" "In my opinion, Cust knows very well that he's responsible for murder," said Dr. Thompson. "The letters prove that the murders were planned crimes." "And we still have no explanation for the letters," said Poirot. "Until I know why they were written, I shall not feel that the case is solved." "Well, I must go," said Dr. Thompson. He went out. Japp stayed. "So, Cust has an alibi for the Bexhill murder," said Poirot. "Yes," said the inspector. "And his alibi is very strong. A man called Strange has told us that he met Cust in the White Cross Hotel in Eastbourne on the evening of the 24th of July. After dinner, he and Cust played cards. Cust played very well. They played cards until midnight and separated at 10 minutes past midnight. So, if Cust was in a hotel in Eastbourne at that time, he couldn't strangle Betty Barnard on the beach at Bexhill between midnight and 1 o'clock. Eastbourne is about 22 kilometres away from Bexhill, and it would take some time for him to get there.
"It is a problem, yes,"
said Poirot. "We know that Cust carried out the Doncaster murder, the coat with the blood, the knife, that's certain. He carried out the Churston murder. He carried out the Andover murder, so he also did the Bexhill murder. But I don't understand how."
"Tell me, Hastings,"
said Poirot after Japp had gone.
"Do you think the case is finished?"
"Well, yes. We've got the man, and we've got most of the facts." Poirot shook his head.
"But until we know all about the man, the mystery is as deep as ever. And we know nothing at all. We know where he was born. We know that he fought in the war and was hit on the head. We know that he left the army because he is an epileptic. We know that he rented a room from Mrs. Marbury. We know that he is very quiet and shy, the kind of man that nobody notices. We know that he planned and carried out several very clever murders. We know that he made some stupid mistakes. We know that he killed without pity. We know that he did not want anyone else to suffer for his crimes. Do you not see, Hastings, that the man is like two different people? All the time I have tried to get to know the murderer. And now I realize, Hastings, that I do not know him at all. I am quite confused. Why did he carry out these murders? Why did he choose those people?
"Alphabetically," I began.
Was Betty Barnard the only person in Bexhill whose name began with a B? Betty Barnard. I had an idea there. It ought to be true. It must be true. But if it is...
He was silent for some time. I didn't like to interrupt him, and I believe I fell asleep. Suddenly I woke to find Poirot's hand on my shoulder.
"Mon cher Hastings,"
he said,
"always you help me. You bring me luck."
I was quite confused. "How have I helped you this time?" I asked.
"I remembered something that you said. It makes everything very clear. I see the answers to all my questions. The reason for Mrs. Asher, the reason for Sir Carmichael Clark, the reason for the Doncaster murder, and finally, very important, the reason for Hercule Poirot. But first, I need a little more information from our special legion. And then, when I have got an answer to one of my questions, I will go and see ABC. We will face each other at last. ABC and Hercule Poirot, the enemies. And then we will talk.
"What do you expect Cust to tell you?" I asked. Hercule Poirot smiled.
"A lie,"
he said.
"And from the lie I shall know the truth."
During the next few days, Poirot was very busy. He was mysteriously absent for a lot of the time. He talked very little and refused to answer any of my questions. But towards the end of the week, he said he intended to visit Bexhill. He suggested that I should come with him, and I agreed enthusiastically. The members of our Special Legion were also invited. Poirot first visited Mr. and Mrs. Barnard, and asked them when exactly Cust had come to their door and what he had said. Then he went to the hotel where Cust had stayed and asked for a detailed description of Cust. Next, he went to the beach, to the place where Betty Barnard's body had been discovered. He studied the ground carefully. He then walked from the beach to the nearest place where a car could be parked. From there, he went to the place where the Eastbourne buses waited before leaving Bexhill. Finally, he took us all to the Orange Cat Cafe, where the fat waitress, Millie Higley, served us tea.
"I have finished in Bexhill," said Poirot. "I will go to Eastbourne. I need to ask one question there. It is not necessary for you all to come with me, but come back to the hotel and let us have a drink. That tea was horrible."
As we were having our drinks, Franklin Clark said, "I suppose we can guess what you're trying to do. You're trying to prove that Cust's alibi is false. You seem very pleased, but I don't know why. You haven't got a new fact of any kind."
"No, that is true,"
said Poirot. Then he continued,
"My friend Hastings told me once that he had, as a young man, played a game called The Truth. Everyone was asked 3 questions. They had to promise to answer 2 questions truthfully."
He paused.
"Eh bien, I want to play that game. But one will be enough. 1 question to each of you."
"Of course," said Clark impatiently. "We'll answer anything."
"Ah, but I want it to be more serious than that. Do you all promise to speak the truth?"
Everyone became as serious as Poirot. They all promised. Then Poirot turned to Franklin Clark.
"What did you think of the hats that the ladies wore at Ascot this year?"
Franklin Clark stared at him in surprise. "Is this a joke?"
"Certainly not."
Clark began to smile. "Well, Monsieur Poirot, I didn't actually go to Ascot, but I saw some of the women driving to the races, And their hats this year were an even bigger joke than the hats they usually wear. Poirot smiled and turned to Donald Fraser.
When did you take your holiday this year?
Fraser stared.
My holiday? The first 2 weeks in August.
Then Poirot turned to Thora Grey, and I heard a slight change in his voice. His question came sharp and clear.
Mademoiselle, after Lady Clark's death, did you hope to marry Sir Carmichael?
The girl jumped up. How dare you ask me such a question? It's insulting.
Perhaps, but you have promised to speak the truth, yes or no.
Sir Carmichael was wonderfully kind to me. He treated me almost like a daughter, and that's how I felt to him. I was fond of him, and grateful too.
Excuse me, but that is not answering yes or no, mademoiselle.
The answer, of course, is no. He turned to Megan Barnard. The girl's face was very pale.
Mademoiselle, what do you hope will be the result of my questions? Do you want me to find out the truth or not?
Megan's head went back proudly. No, she said clearly. We all jumped. Poirot sat forward, studying her face.
Mademoiselle Megan, he said, you may not want the truth, but you can speak it, he said.
He turned towards the door, then remembered Mary Drower.
Tell me, have you a young man?
Mary looked at him nervously.
Oh, Mr. Poirot, well, I'm not sure.
Poirot smiled. Then he looked round for me.
Come, Hastings, we must start for Eastbourne.
The car was waiting, and soon we were driving along the coast road that leads through Pevensey to Eastbourne. Poirot seemed very pleased with himself. As we passed through Pevensey, he suggested that we should stop and look at the castle there. As we were returning to the car, we passed a group of children in a circle singing a song.
What is it they are saying, Hastings?
Asked Poirot. I listened until I understood. And catch a fox, and put him in a box, and never let him go. Poirot repeated the words. His face suddenly became very serious.
That is very terrible, Hastings.
He was silent.
You hunt the fox here?
I don't. I've never been able to afford to hunt. And I don't think there's much hunting in this part of the world.
I meant in England generally. A strange sport. The dogs run after the fox, and at last they catch him, and he dies, quickly and horribly. But the quick, cruel death is better than what those children were singing. It is not good to be shut away in a box forever. Tomorrow I am going to visit Cust. Now, let's go back to London.
Aren't we going to Eastbourne? I cried.
What for? I know quite enough now.
I was not present at the interview between Poirot and that strange man, Alexander Bonaparte Cust. Because of his relationship with the police, Poirot was able to be there, but I wasn't included in the special permission that was needed. Poirot also wanted the interview to be completely private, the two men face to face. But when Poirot came back, he told me all about it in great detail. Mr. Cust seemed smaller, and to stoop even more. His fingers pulled nervously at his coat. For a time, Poirot sat and looked at him. At last he said gently,
"Do you know who I am?"
Mr. Cust shook his head. No, I don't. Or are you from Mr. Maynard, from his law office?" He was polite, but didn't seem very interested. His mind seemed to be on something else, something inside himself.
"I am Hercule Poirot."
He said the words very gently, and watched for the effect. Mr. Cust lifted his head a little. "Oh, yes," he said. Then, a minute later, he repeated the words again.
"Oh, yes."
This time he sounded different, more interested. He looked at Poirot. Poirot looked back and nodded.
"Yes," he said. "I am the man that you wrote the letters to."
At once the contact was broken. Mr. Cust dropped his eyes and spoke crossly. "I never wrote to you," he said. "Those letters weren't written by me. I've said so again and again."
"I know,"
said Poirot.
"But if you did not write them, who did?"
"An enemy. I must have an enemy. They are all against me. The police, everyone, all against me." Poirot didn't reply. "Everyone has been against me. Always."
"Even when you were a child?"
Mr. Cust seemed to think about that. No, not exactly then. My mother was very fond of me. She thought I was going to be special, that I could do anything." He was silent for a minute. "But she was quite wrong. I was afraid of people. I had a bad time at school. And later, when I started work, I had the feeling that everyone thought I was stupid."
"And in the war?"
asked Poirot. "You know," said Mr. Cust, and his face lit up, "I enjoyed the war. I felt, for the first time, like a man." His smile disappeared. "But then I got hit on the head, so they made me leave the army. I started working in an office, but things were very difficult. I had very little money, and then I got the offer of the job selling stockings."
"You told us the name of the company, but you know now, don't you,"
said Poirot in a gentle voice,
"that that company didn't employ you?"
That's because they're against me too. I've got their letters to me, giving me instructions about places to go to and a list of people to visit.
Their letters weren't written,
said Poirot.
They were typed. All those letters were typed on the machine which was found in your room. So it seems that you typed them yourself and posted them to yourself.
No, said Mr. Cust. It's because they're all against me.
And the ABCs that were found in the cupboard?
I know nothing about them. I thought they were stockings.
Why did you put a mark by the name of Mrs. Asher in that first list of people in Andover?
Because I decided to visit her first. One must begin somewhere. But I didn't murder her. I'm completely innocent. It's all a mistake. Look at that second crime, the Bexhill one. I was playing cards in Eastbourne.
You play cards very well, I believe,
said Poirot. Well, I believe I do. You'd be surprised how a game of cards can bring strangers together. I remember one man. I've never forgotten him because of something he told me. We just got talking over a cup of coffee and we started playing cards.
What did he tell you?
Asked Poirot. Mr. Cust's face looked worried. He read my future in my hand. He said I would be one of the most famous men in England before I died. He said the whole country would talk about me. But he said I would die a violent death. He was silent suddenly. My head. I suffer very badly. I'll get cruel headaches sometimes. And then there are times when I don't know. He stopped.
But you do know, don't you?
Poirot said.
That you carried out the murders?
Mr. Cust looked up. He looked strangely at peace.
Yes,
he said.
I know. But I am right, am I not? You don't know why you carried them out.
Mr. Cust shook his head. No, he said. I don't. Chapter 12. Poirot explains.
You must realize that you are a very famous man. Probably the most famous man in England.
Poirot called a meeting of the Special Legion.
From the beginning, he said, I have been worried about the why of this case. The mystery was not the mystery of the murders, but the mystery of ABC. Why was it necessary for him to carry out these murders? Why did he choose me as his enemy? It is no answer to say that the man was mad. As soon as I received the first letter, I was upset and worried. It seemed to me that there was something very wrong about the letter.
"You are quite right," said Franklin Clark.
Yes, but then at the beginning I made a serious mistake. The letter made me very worried. The police thought it was a joke. I was sure that a murder would happen in Andover. As you know, a murder did happen. There was no way of knowing who the person was who had carried out the murder. I had to try and understand what kind of a person had done it. I had to discover the motive of the crime, the motive of the letter. Why did the murderer send the letter to me? Why not to Scotland Yard? Or to a newspaper? Why to Hercule Poirot? Was it for a personal reason? Then the second letter arrived, and was followed by the murder of Betty Barnard. It became clear now that the murders were going to take place according to an alphabetical plan. But why did ABC need to carry out these murders? When we think about the 4 victims, or 3 of them, since I know very little about Mr. Downs or Mr. Earlsfield, we realize that it was possible for the murderer to kill them without anyone suspecting him. The clear suspects were Franz Asher, Donald Fraser, or Megan Barnard, or possibly Mr. Clark. Why then did the murderer need to call attention to himself? Why did he need to leave on each body an ABC railway guide? I was learning certain things about the murderer. His crimes were listed alphabetically. That was clearly important. His victims were men and women and of different ages, so age and sex were not important to him. The choice of the ABC suggested to me that it was someone who was interested in railways. This is more common in men than in women. Small boys love trains more than small girls. It might be a sign, too, of someone whose mind was not of an adult, someone who was still a boy. The death of Betty Barnard gave me other clues. She was strangled with her own belt. Therefore, she was killed by someone she was friendly with. Betty Barnard liked attention from good-looking men. She went out with ABC, so he was attractive to women.
Donald Fraser jumped up angrily. "Mr. Poirot, please."
"It is finished,"
said Poirot.
"I will say no more. We will pass to the next murder, the murder of Sir Carmichael Clark. Here the murderer goes back to his first method, hitting the victim on the head. We were unlucky over this crime, since the warning letter did not reach us in time. Therefore, no preparations could be made to stop the crime. Then the clue of the stockings was discovered. The appearance of a stocking seller near the scene of each crime could not be a coincidence. So, he must be the murderer. But his description, as given by Miss Gray, did not match my picture of the man who strangled Miss Barnard. A fourth murder was carried out. The murder of a man named George Earlsfield. In mistake, we thought for a man named Downs. And now, the murderer's luck changes and ABC is at last arrested. The case, as Hastings says, has ended. The man is in prison. Finish. But not for me. I still don't know the why. And there is one small, annoying fact. The man cussed has an alibi for the night of the Bexhill crime.
That's been worrying me, too, said Franklin Clark.
Yes,
continued Poirot.
The alibi seems real, but it cannot be real unless... And now we come to two very interesting ideas. Supposing, my friends, that while Cust was responsible for 3 of the crimes, the A, C, and D crimes, he did not carry out the B crime.
Monsieur Poirot, it isn't... said Megan Barnard. Poirot silenced Megan Barnard with a look.
Be quiet, mademoiselle,
said Poirot.
I want the truth. I have finished with lies. Suppose I say that someone else murdered Betty Barnard.
Monsieur Poirot, surely all the crimes were done by the same person. Poirot took no notice of Megan and continued,
I told you that there was a second idea. Supposing that someone else killed Betty Barnard. Did that someone else do the other murders too?
But that doesn't make sense, cried Clark.
Doesn't it? I examined the letters again. I had felt from the beginning that there was something wrong with them. I had thought they were written by a madman. But then I realized they were not. They were false. The writer was only pretending to be mad. What would be the reason for writing such letters? To call the police's attention to the murders? At first, it did not seem to make sense. And then I saw light. It was to call the police's attention to several murders, to a group of murders, so that one of those murders would not be noticed. I was facing a very clever murderer. Not Mr. Cust. I was facing a very different kind of man, a man who enjoyed behaving like a boy. Remember the schoolboy-like letters and the railway guide? And who was attractive to women. A man who played an important part in one of the crimes. I thought all about the crimes again. The Andover crime? The most likely suspect was Franz Asher, but I could not imagine that Asher could invent and carry out such a complicated plan. The Bexhill crime. Donald Fraser was clever and had ability, but his motive for killing his girlfriend could only be jealousy. It was very unlikely that such a crime would be planned. We now come to the Churston crime. Sir Carmichael Clark was a very rich man. who will get his money after he dies? His wife, who is dying, and then it goes to his brother, Franklin.
Poirot turned slowly round and looked at Franklin Clark.
I was quite sure then. ABC and the Franklin Clark were the same person. Franklin Clark is attractive to women. He could easily make a girl in a cafe go out with him. He enjoys making lists. He made a list here one day. And finally, his boyish behavior. Lady Clark told us about that. I was quite sure in my own mind. The writer of the letters and the murderer was Franklin Clark.
Franklin Clark started to laugh. And what about our friend Cust? What about the blood on his coat? And the knife he hid? He may say he didn't do the crimes.
You are quite wrong, said Poirot. He says he did do the murders. He believes himself to be guilty. But as soon as I saw him, I knew he could not be guilty. He is not clever enough. No, there were two people who played a part in these crimes. The real murderer, clever and daring, and the false murderer, weak and stupid. I think you had the idea when you first met Mr. Cust in a coffee shop. You were thinking about murdering your brother. You showed me a letter your brother had written to you. In it, he showed how fond he was of Miss Thora Grey. You were afraid that when Lady Clark died, your brother might marry Miss Grey and have children. Then you would not get any of his money. Your meeting with Mr. Cust gave you an idea. His strange names, his epilepsy, and his weak character made him the tool that you were looking for. The whole alphabetical plan jumped into your mind. You contacted a company that made stockings and asked for a large number of stockings to be sent to Cust. You sent him a number of ABC railway guides. You wrote a letter to him, pretending that it came from the stocking company and offering him good pay for selling stockings. You made your plans so well that you typed all the letters that were sent later. Then you gave him the machine on which they were typed. You found two victims whose names began with A and B. You sent a list of customers in the Andover area to Cust, telling him to go there on a certain date. Mrs. Asher's name was on the list. You sent the first ABC letter to me. Then you went to Andover and killed Mrs. Asher. For the second murder, you probably killed Betty Barnard before midnight on the 24th. We now come to murder number 3, the important murder for you. And here I must thank Hastings. He suggested that the third letter was sent to the wrong address on purpose. And he was right. I had wondered, why were the letters addressed to Hercule Poirot, a private detective, and not to the police? You wanted one of the letters to get lost and reach us too late. But a letter to Scotland Yard could not get lost, so you sent it to a private address. You wanted the police to find out about it only when the murder was safely done. Your brother's nightly walk gave you the opportunity. And everyone was thinking about ABC. Nobody thought that you might be guilty. After your brother's murder, your purpose was finished. You wanted Mr. Cuss to be arrested as the murderer, but nobody had noticed him. So you decided that one more murder was necessary. You chose Doncaster as the scene of your next crime. Everything was made very public in the newspapers. You gave instructions to Mr. Cuss to go to Doncaster. In the afternoon, he went to a cinema. You were there too. You stabbed a man and put the ABC railway guide under his feet. When Mr. Cuss left, you followed him and put the bloody knife in his coat pocket. And now, my friends, let us imagine how Mr. Cuss thought about all this. The Andover crime means nothing to him. He is shocked and surprised by the Bexhill crime. He was there at about the same time. Then comes the Churston crime. 3 crimes, and he has been at the scene of each of them. Epilepsy sufferers cannot always remember what they have done. Then he receives the order to go to Doncaster. Doncaster. And the next ABC crime will be in Doncaster. He becomes afraid and tells people he is going to Cheltenham. He goes to Doncaster and visits a cinema in the afternoon. When he gets back to his hotel, he discovers there is blood on his coat. So he thinks he himself is the killer. He is quite sure of the truth. He, Alexander Bonaparte Cust, is a mad killer. He behaves like a hunted animal. He goes back to his rented room in London. He has the knife with him still. He hides it behind the coat stand. Then he is warned that the police are coming. They know. I don't know why he went to Andover. Maybe he wanted to look at the place of the crime, although he could remember nothing about it. He has no money left. He is very tired. He goes to a police station. When I saw him, I knew at once that he was not the murderer, and that my name meant nothing to him. I knew that he thought he was the murderer.
"Your idea," said Franklin Clark, "is completely mad."
"No, Mr. Clark. I found the stick which you used in the Andover and Churston murders in a cupboard at Churston. An ordinary stick with a thick handle. 2 people from the cinema in Doncaster recognized your photograph. Millie Higley, the waitress at Bexhill, remembered you. And you left a fingerprint on Cust's typewriter."
Clark sat silently for a minute. Then he said, "You win, Monsieur Poirot." He took a small gun out of his pocket and held it to his head. He tried to shoot it, but the gun didn't work. Clark stared at it in surprise.
"No, Mr. Clark,"
said Poirot.
"Perhaps you noticed that I had a new servant today, a friend of mine. He used to be a clever thief. He removed your gun from your pocket and made it safe. Then he put it back. No, Mr. Clark, there will be no easy death for you. Your crime was not at all English, not fair.
Two detectives from Scotland Yard came out from the next room. One of them was Crome. They arrested Franklin Clark and took him away. As the door behind Franklin Clark closed, I'm sorry to say that I started to laugh. Poirot looked at me in surprise. "It's because you told him his crime wasn't fair," I said.
It was quite true. It was very cruel. Not only the murder of his brother, but to shut a man away forever in a prison for mad people, like a living death. To catch a fox and put him in a box and never let him go. That is not sport, not fair.
Megan Barnard said, "I can't believe it. I can't. Is it true?"
"Yes, mademoiselle,"
said Poirot.
"It's finished."
He turned to Fraser.
Mademoiselle Megan was always afraid that you were responsible for the second crime.
"I thought so myself at one time," said Donald Fraser quietly.
"Because of your dream? Your dream has a very natural explanation. In it, you find that one sister is being replaced by the other. Mademoiselle Megan is taking the place of her sister in your heart. But you feel guilty, so you try to kill the thought. Do not be afraid to forget," said Poirot gently. "Mademoiselle Megan is very special. She has a wonderful heart."
Donald Fraser's eyes lit up. "I believe you're right," he said. We all crowded round Poirot, asking questions.
"Why did you ask those truth questions, Poirot?" "I wanted to see Franklin Clark's face when I asked my question of Mademoiselle Thora. His eyes were full of hate and anger."
"Franklin Clark knew it was the end for him when you told him about the fingerprint on the typewriter," I said.
"Yes, they are useful, fingerprints. I told him that to please you."
"But Poirot," I cried, "wasn't it true?"
"Not at all, mon ami,"
said Hercule Poirot. A few days later, we had a visit from Mr. Alexander Bonaparte Cust. He shook Poirot's hand and said, "Do you know, a newspaper has actually offered me £100 if I tell them about my life. I really don't know what to do about it."
"You should not accept 100,
said Poirot.
"Say that 500 is your price, and tell the other newspapers about it as well. You must realize that you are a very famous man, probably the most famous man in England."
Mr. Cust looked very happy. "Do you know, I believe you're right, Monsieur Poirot," said Mr. Cust. "The money will be nice, very nice. I'll have a little holiday. And then I want to give a nice wedding present to Lily Marbury. Really, a dear girl."
"You are quite right,"
said Poirot.
"And just a word. What about a visit to an eye doctor? The reason for those headaches is probably that you need new glasses."
"Do you think so?" Mr. Cust shook him warmly by the hand. "You're a very great man, Monsieur Poirot." When Mr. Cust had left, my old friend smiled across at me.
"So, Hastings, we went hunting once more, did we not?"